Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing Part 2 of Chapter 2 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. The title translates roughly to Discourse on the Descent into Lanka. The text recounts Shakyamuni giving the teaching to a bodhisattva named Mahamati, or Great Wisdom, as they bring the Dharma to the mythical land of Lanka, often interpreted as modern-day Sri Lanka, which is ruled by Ravana, the king of the Rakshasas. The Lankavatara discusses numerous Mahāyāna concepts, such as Yogācāra mind-only doctrine, the three natures, the Alaya Vijnana, or storehouse consciousness, Gotra theory, Buddha nature, the luminous mind, emptiness, and vegetarianism. In this section, Mahamati and the Buddha discuss esoteric Buddhist concepts, such as the Trikaya, their relationship to mind-only doctrine, eternality, and the implications of self-realization of the Dharma. We hope you enjoy. Then, at that time, the Blessed One recited these verses. The world as we see it exists not. Pluralities of things arise from the mind being seen externally. Body, property, and abode are manifested to us as of the Alaya Vijnana. The leaders talk about the Chitta, Manas, Mano-Vijnana, the triple Svabhava, the five Dharmas, the twofold egolessness, and purification. Long and short, etc., exist mutually bound up. When existence is asserted, there is non-existence, and where non-existence is asserted, there is existence. Analyzed down to atoms, there is indeed no form to be discriminated as such. What can be established is the truth of mind only, which is not believed by those who cherish erroneous views. This does not belong to the realm of the theoreticians, or that of the Shravaka. The Buddhas disclose the way of self-realization. At that time, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, made a request of the Blessed One regarding the purification of the outflow which comes from recognizing an objective world which is of mind itself, saying, How, O Blessed One, is the outflow purified that takes place from recognizing an external world which is of mind itself? Is the purification instantaneous or gradual? Replied the Blessed One, The outflow that takes place from recognizing an external world which is of mind itself is gradually purified and not instantaneously. Mahamati, it is like the amra fruit, which ripens gradually and not instantaneously. In the same way, Mahamati, the purification of beings is gradual and not instantaneous. Mahamati, it is like the potter making pots, which is done gradually and not instantaneously. In the same way, Mahamati, the purification of beings by the Tathagata is gradual and not instantaneous. Mahamati, it is like grass, shrubs, herbs, and trees that grow up gradually from the earth and not instantaneously. In the same way, Mahamati, the purification by the Tathagata of beings is gradual and not instantaneous. Mahamati, it is like the mastery of comedy, dancing, singing, music, lute playing, writing, and other arts, which is gained gradually and not instantaneously. In the same way, Mahamati, the purification by the Tathagata of all beings is gradual and not instantaneous. Mahamati, it is like a mirror indiscriminately and instantaneously reflecting in it forms and images. In the same way, Mahamati, the purification of the Tathagata of all beings is instantaneous, who makes them free from discrimination and leads them to the state of imagelessness. Mahamati, it is like the sun or the moon revealing all forms instantaneously by illuminating them with its light. In the same way, Mahamati, the Tathagata, by making all things discard the habit energy which issues from the erroneous views they entertain in regard to an external world which is of the mind, instantaneously reveals to all beings the realm of unthinkable knowledge which belongs to Buddhahood. It is like the Alaya Vijnana making instantaneously a world of itself. In the same way, Mahamati, the Nishanda Buddha, instantaneously maturing the mentality of beings, places them in the palatial abode of the Akanistha mansion, where they will become practitioners of various spiritual exercises. Mahamati, it is like the Dharmata Buddha shining forth instantaneously with the rays that issue from the Nishanda Nirmana Buddha. In the same way, Mahamati, the noble truth of self-realization instantaneously shines out when the false dualistic views of existence and non-existence are discarded. And yet again, Mahamati, what the Dharmata Nishanda Buddha, that is, the Buddha that flows out from the Absolute Dharma, teaches is that all things are comprehensible under the aspects of individuality and generality, for they are bound up with causes and conditions of habit energy, which is accumulated by not recognizing an external world as of mind itself. That by reason of clinging to these false imaginations, there is multitudinousness of unrealities, which resemble the various scenes and persons created magically and imagined as really in existence. Further again, Mahamati, the false imaginations arise from clinging to the notion of relativity. To illustrate, when the magician, depending upon grass, wood, shrubs, and creepers, exercises his art, all beings and forms take shape. Magically created persons are produced, which appear endowed with individuality and material body, and they are variously and fancifully discriminated. While they are thus manifesting themselves, Mahamati, there is no substantiality in them. Likewise, Mahamati, based on the notion of relativity, the false imagination recognizes a variety of appearances which are distinguished by a discriminating mind. And as their individual appearances are imagined and adhered to, there is habit energy. And Mahamati, so long as the fancying goes on, we have here all that is needed to constitute the self-nature of the false imagination. Mahamati, this is the discourse of the Nishanda Buddha. Again, Mahamati, it is the doing of the Dharmata Buddha to establish the exalted state of self-realization which transcends the phenomena of the empirical mind. Again, Mahamati, what the Nirmata Nirmana Buddha, or the Buddha of transformation, establishes concerns such matters as charity, morality, meditation, tranquilization, various forms of transcendental knowledge and of understanding, the skandhas, dhatus, the ayatanas, emancipation, the vijnanas, and the ways in which they function, the forms which they take, their distinctions and their performances. The Buddha discloses against the philosophical views that which surpasses forms. Again, Mahamati, the Dharmata Buddha is unconditioned, free from conditions, has nothing to do with all doings, senses, and measurements, and does not belong to the world of the ignorant, Shravakas, Pratyeka-Buddhas, and philosophers, who are always clinging to the notion of an ego. For this reason, Mahamati, you should discipline yourself in the excellent and exalted way leading to self-realization. You should keep yourself away from the views that recognize the reality of an external world apart from the mind itself. Further again, Mahamati, in the life of the Shravaka vehicle, there are two aspects to be distinguished, namely the excellent and exalted state of self-realization, and the attachment to the notion of self-nature arising from discrimination. What is the excellent, exalted state of self-realization belonging to the Shravakas? This is a state of mental concentration which is attained when one realizes states of emptiness, egolessness, suffering and impermanence, and the truth that is free from passions and is ever serene, when one annihilates notions belonging to the externality of things, such as the skandhas, dhatus, ayatanas, individuality, and generality, and when one has an insight into reality as it is. Entering upon this state of mental concentration, the Shravakas will attain the blissful abode of exalted self-realization in which there is the emancipation belonging to the jhana, the path and fruit of a samadhi, and the deliverance of a samapatti, but in which there is as yet no discarding of habit energy and no escape from the imperceivable transformation of death. This, Mahamati, is the Shravaka's exalted state of self-realization. Having attained this exalted and blissful condition of self-realization as realized by the Shravakas, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva may not enjoy by himself the bliss of cessation, the bliss of samapatti, but should think compassionately of other beings and keep ever fresh his original vows. Mahamati, in whatever exalted and blissful state of self-realization the Bodhisattva may find himself, he should never exert himself in the exalted and blissful state of self-realization as attained by the Shravakas. Mahamati, what is meant by the attachment to the notion of self-nature arising from discrimination? This attachment takes place when a man, seeing that the elements and the qualities such as blue, yellow, warmth, humidity, motility, and rigidity have never been created by a creator, yet clings to the notions of individuality and generality in accordance with the measures laid down in books of logic. Mahamati, the Bodhisattva, knowing what this is, must abandon it. Conforming himself to the egolessness of things and holding back the wrong views regarding the egolessness of a person, the Bodhisattva should keep himself on the continuously ascending journey along the stages. This is the Shravaka's attachment to the notion of self-nature arising from the discrimination of existence. At that time, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, said this to the Blessed One. According to the Blessed One's teaching, the eternal unthinkable is the exalted condition of self-realization and also of highest reality. Now, do not the philosophers also talk about the creative agent being the eternal unthinkable? The Blessed One replied, No, Mahamati, the eternal unthinkable considered by the philosophers to be characteristic of their creator is untenable. Why? Because Mahamati, the eternal unthinkable, as held by the philosophers, is not in conformity with the idea of a cause itself. When, Mahamati, this eternal unthinkable is not in conformity with the idea of a cause itself, how can this be proved tenable? Again, Mahamati, if what is claimed to be the eternal unthinkable is in conformity with the idea of a cause, which is eternal in itself, it can be eternal. But since the idea of a creator is based upon that of a further cause, it cannot be the eternal unthinkable. But Mahamati, my highest reality is the eternal unthinkable, since it conforms to the idea of a cause and is beyond existence and non-existence. Because it is the exalted state of self-realization, it has its own character. Because it is the cause of the highest reality, it has its causation. Because it has nothing to do with existence and non-existence, it is no doer. Because it is to be classed under the same head as space, nirvana, and cessation, it is eternal. Therefore, Mahamati, it is not the same as the eternal unthinkable of the philosophers. The eternal unthinkable of the Tathagatas is thatness, realized by noble wisdom within themselves. For this reason, Mahamati, let the Bodhisattva Mahasattva discipline himself in order to attain by means of noble wisdom the truth of self-realization, which is the eternal unthinkable. Again, further, Mahamati, the eternal unthinkable of the philosophers is not characterized with eternality, because it has a cause which is not eternal. What they regard as eternal is not eternal, as it is not characterized with the power that can create itself. If again, Mahamati, the philosophers prove the eternality of their eternal unthinkable in contradistinction to the becoming and therefore the non-eternality of things created, Mahamati, by the same reasoning, I can prove that their eternality has no reason to be known as such, just because things created are non-eternal owing to their becoming. If again, Mahamati, the eternal unthinkable of the philosophers is in conformity with the idea of a cause, what they regard as characteristic of a cause is a non-entity, like the horns of a hare, and, Mahamati, their eternal unthinkable is no more than a verbal discrimination, in which, Mahamati, the philosopher's fault consists. Why? Because, Mahamati, mere verbal discriminations are, indeed, the hare's horns, on account of their having no characteristic of a self-cause. Mahamati, moreover, my eternal unthinkable is really eternal because it finds its cause in the exalted state of self-realization, and because it has nothing to do with a creator, with being and non-being. Its eternality is not derived from the reasoning which is based upon the external notion of being and non-being, of eternity and non-eternity. If the eternal unthinkable is eternal in consideration of the non-existence and eternality of external things, we can say of this kind of eternal unthinkable that the philosophers do not know what is meant by characteristically self-caused. As they are outside the state of self-realization attainable by noble wisdom, Mahamati, their discourse is not to the point. Further, Mahamati, those who, afraid of sufferings arising from the discrimination of birth and death, seek for nirvana, do not know that birth and death and nirvana are not to be separated the one from the other. And, seeing that all things subject to discrimination have no reality, imagine that nirvana consists in the future annihilation of the senses and their fields. They are not aware, Mahamati, of the fact that nirvana is the alaya vijnana, where a revulsion takes place by self-realization. Therefore, Mahamati, those who are stupid talk of the trinity of vehicles, and not of the state of mind only, where there are no images. Therefore, Mahamati, those who do not understand the teachings of the Tathagatas of the past, present, and future concerning the external world, which is of mind itself, cling to the notion that there is a world outside what is seen by the mind, and, Mahamati, go on rolling themselves along the wheel of birth and death. Further, Mahamati, according to the teaching of the Tathagatas of the past, present, and future, all things are unborn. Why? Because they have no reality, being manifestations of mind itself. And, Mahamati, as they are not born of being and non-being, they are unborn. Mahamati, all things are like the horns of the hare, horse, donkey, or camel, but the ignorant and simple-minded who are given up to their false and erroneous imaginations discriminate things where they are not. Therefore, all things are unborn. That all things are in their self-nature unborn, Mahamati, belongs to the realm of self-realization attained by noble wisdom, and does not belong essentially to the realm of dualistic discrimination cherished by the ignorant and simple-minded. The self-nature and the characteristic marks of body, property, and abode evolve when the alaya vijnana is conceived by the ignorant as grasping and grasped, and then they fall into a dualistic view of existence where they recognize its rise, abiding, and disappearance, cherishing the idea that all things are born and subject to discrimination as to being and non-being. Therefore, Mahamati, you should discipline yourself therein, i.e., in self-realization. Again, further, Mahamati, there are 5 groups of people, each of whom attains its own spiritual insight. What are the 5? They are 1. The group of people whose insight belongs to the Shravaka vehicle. 2. The group of people whose insight belongs to the Pratyeka vehicle. 3. The group of people whose insight belongs to the Tathagata vehicle. 4. The group of indefinite character. And 5. The group of people to whom no insight is possible. Mahamati, how does one know the group of people whose insight belongs to the Shravaka vehicle? There are people the hair of whose body will stand on end when they know and realize the nature of the skandhas, dhatus, ayatanas, and what is meant by generality and individuality. Their intellect will leap with joy on knowing and practicing what belongs to appearance, and not on practicing what they know of the uninterrupted chain of causation. Such ones, Mahamati, are said to be the group whose insight belongs to the Shravaka vehicle. Having had an insight into their own vehicle, they abide at the 5th or 6th stage, where they do away with the rising of the passions, but do not with the habit energy. They have not yet passed beyond the inconceivable transformation death, and their lion roar is, "My life is destroyed, my morality is established," etc. They will then discipline themselves in the egolessness of persons, and finally gain the knowledge of nirvana. Again, Mahamati, there are others who, believing in such things as ego, being, vital principle, nourisher, supreme spirit, or personal soul, will seek nirvana in them. Again, Mahamati, there are still others who, seeing that all things exist by depending upon causes, will recognize in this the way to nirvana. But Mahamati, as they have no insight into the egolessness of things, there is no emancipation for them. This, Mahamati, is where those of the Shravaka vehicle and the philosophers make the mistake in their insight by regarding non-deliverance as deliverance. Therefore, Mahamati, you ought to discipline yourself in order to escape this wrong view. Now, Mahamati, they belong to the group of the Pratyeka vehicle, who will shed tears and feel the hair of their body stand on end when the Pratyeka insight is shown to them. When the teaching to keep themselves away from social relationships and entanglements, not to become attached to the external world and its manifold form, to perform miraculous powers by which they can divide their own body and appear double or perform the transformations, is disclosed to them, they are thereby entreated. Recognizing that they are of the group whose insight belong to the Pratyeka vehicle, their discourses will be in conformity with the insight of the Pratyeka vehicle. This, Mahamati, is the characteristic feature of the group of people whose insight belongs to the Pratyeka vehicle. Now, Mahamati, 3 aspects are distinguishable in the insight belonging to the group of the Tathagata vehicle. They are 1. An insight whereby one sees into the self-nature of things, which is no self-nature. 2. An exalted insight, which is the attainment of self-realization. And 3. An insight into the immensity of the external Buddha lands. When, Mahamati, these 3 aspects are disclosed one after another, and also when the inconceivable realm of the Alaya Vijnana is disclosed, where body, property, and abode are seen to be the manifestation of mind itself, a man will not be frightened, nor terrified, nor show any sign of fear. Then, such a one is to be known as the group of people whose insight belongs to the Tathagata vehicle. This is, Mahamati, the characteristic feature of the insight of those who belong to the Tathagata vehicle. Again, Mahamati, when these 3 forms of insight are disclosed to a man, he may thereby be persuaded to discipline himself in them. This, Mahamati, is the stage of preparation for the establishment of his own group. In order that he may go up to the stage of imagelessness, there is this establishment. But the Shravaka who will purify his own habit energy of passions by attaining an inner perception into the alaya, and by seeing into the egolessness of things, he will settle himself in the bliss of the samadhi and finally will attain the body of Tathagatahood. Then the Blessed One recited these verses. The fruit of the stream entered, and that of the once to come, the fruit of the not to come, and arhatship. All these are due to mental perturbation. The triple vehicle, the one vehicle, and the no vehicle, of these I talk, for the sake of the dull-witted, and also for the wise, solitude-loving ones. The gate of highest reality has nothing to do with the 2 forms of thought construction, subject and object. Where the imageless stands, why should we establish the triple vehicles? the jhanas, the immeasurables, and the no-form samadhis, and the thought cessation, all these are not at all found in mind only. Again, Mahamati, how is it that the Achantaka never awaken the desire for emancipation? Because they have abandoned all the stock of merit, and because they cherish certain vows for all beings since beginningless time. What is meant by abandoning all the stock of merit? It refers to those Buddhists who have abandoned the Bodhisattva collection of the canonical texts, making the false accusation that they are not in conformity with the sutras, the codes of morality, and the emancipation. By this they have forsaken all the stock of merit and will never enter into nirvana. Secondly, again, Mahamati, there are Bodhisattva Mahasattvas who, on account of their original vows made for all beings, saying, so long as they do not attain nirvana, I will not attain it myself, keep themselves away from nirvana. This, Mahamati, is the reason for their not entering into nirvana, and because of this, they go on the way of the Achantaka. Again, Mahamati said, who, Blessed One, would never enter nirvana? The Blessed One replied, knowing that all things are in nirvana itself from the very beginning, the Bodhisattva Achantaka would never enter nirvana. But those Achantakas who have forsaken all the stock of merit finally do. Those Achantakas, Mahamati, who have forsaken all the stock of merit might someday be influenced by the power of the Tathagatas and be induced at any moment to foster the stock of merit. Why? Because, Mahamati, no beings are left aside by the Tathagatas. For this reason, Mahamati, it is the Bodhisattva Achantaka who never enters into nirvana. Further, Mahamati, let the Bodhisattva Mahasattva be well acquainted with the three kinds of svabhava, or self-nature. What are the three? They are 1. False discrimination, 2. Knowledge of relativity, and 3. Perfect knowledge. Now, Mahamati, false discrimination rises from form, or nimitta. How, Mahamati, does it rise from form? In consideration of the relativity aspect of svabhava, realities appear in various ways, as having forms, signs, and shapes. When, Mahamati, these objects, forms, and signs are adhered to as real, this adherence takes place in 2 ways. The Tathagatas, Arhats, and fully enlightened ones thus declare false discrimination to consist in attachment to names and attachment to objects. By the attachment to objects is meant, Mahamati, to get attached to inner and external things as realities. By the attachment to names is meant to recognize in these inner and external things the characteristic marks of individuality and generality. The knowledge of the relativity aspect, paratantra, rises from the separation of subject, asraya, and object, alambana. Now, Mahamati, what is perfect knowledge? It is realized when one casts aside the discriminating notions of form, name, reality, and character. It is the inner realization by noble wisdom. This perfect knowledge, Mahamati, is the essence of the Tathagata Garbha. Then the Blessed One recited this verse. Form, name, and discrimination correspond to the 2 forms of svabhava, and right knowledge and suchness correspond to the perfect knowledge aspect. This, Mahamati, is called the doctrine that examines into the nature of the 5 dharmas and the 2 svabhavas, or self-natures, and constitutes the state of self-realization attained by noble wisdom. And in this, you and other bodhisattvas are to discipline yourselves. Further again, Mahamati, let the Bodhisattva Mahasattva have a thorough understanding as to the nature of the 2-fold egolessness. Mahamati, what is this 2-fold egolessness? It is the egolessness of persons and the egolessness of things. What is meant by the egolessness of persons? It means that in the collection of the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas, there is no ego substance, nor anything belonging to it. The vijnana is originated by ignorance, deed, and desire, and keeps up its function by grasping objects by means of the sense organs, such as the eye, etc., and by clinging to them as real, while a world of objects and bodies is manifested owing to the discrimination that takes place in the world which is of mind itself, that is, in the alaya vijnana. By reason of the habit energy stored up by false imagination since beginningless time, this world is subject to change and destruction from moment to moment. It is like a river, a seed, a lamp, wind, a cloud, while the vijnana itself is like a monkey who is always restless, like a fly who is ever in search of unclean things and defiled places, like a fire which is never satisfied. Again, it is like a water-drawing wheel or a machine. It, i.e. the vijnana, goes on rolling, the wheel of transmigration, carrying varieties of bodies and forms, resuscitating the dead like the demon Vitala, causing the wooden figures to move about as a magician moves them. Mahamati, a thorough understanding concerning these phenomena, is called comprehending the egolessness of persons. Now, Mahamati, what is meant by the egolessness of things? It is to realize that the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas are characterized with the nature of false discrimination. Mahamati, since the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas are destitute of an ego substance, being no more than an aggregation of the skandhas, and subject to the conditions of mutual origination which are causally bound up with the string of desire and deed, and since thus there is no creating agent in them, Mahamati, the skandhas are even destitute of the marks of individuality and generality, and the ignorant, owing to their erroneous discrimination, imagine here the multiplicity of phenomena. The wise, however, do not. Recognizing, Mahamati, that all things are devoid of the citta, manas, manovijnana, the 5 dharmas, and the 3 svabhavas, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva will well understand what is meant by the egolessness of things. Again, Mahamati, when the Bodhisattva Mahasattva has a good understanding as regards the egolessness of things, before long he will attain the first stage of Bodhisattvahood, when he gets a definite cognition of the imageless. When a definite acquisition is obtained regarding the aspect of the stages of Bodhisattvahood, the Bodhisattva will experience joy, and gradually and successfully going up the scale will reach the 9th stage, where his insight is perfected, and finally the 10th stage, known as Great Dharma Megha. Establishing himself here, he will be seated in the great jewel palace known as Great Lotus Throne, which is in the shape of a lotus and is adorned with various sorts of jewels and pearls. He will then acquire and complete a world of Maya nature, surrounded by bodhisattvas of the same character and anointed like the son of the Chakravarti by the hands of the Buddhas coming up from all the Buddha lands. He will go beyond the last stage of bodhisattvahood, attain the noble truth of self-realization, and become a Tathagata, endowed with the perfect freedom of the Dharmakaya, because of his insight into the egolessness of things. This, Mahamati, is what is meant by the egolessness of all things, and in this you and the other Bodhisattva Mahasattvas should well exercise yourselves. At that time, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, said this to the Blessed One: "Pray teach me about making an assertion and refuting it, so that I and other Bodhisattvas, getting rid of the erroneous views that may arise from assertion and refutation, may at once realize supreme enlightenment." Having been enlightened, they would keep themselves away from the eternalistic assertions as well as from the nihilistic refutations, and leave your enlightenment eye unrefuted. Then the Blessed One, again, understanding the request of Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, recited this verse: "Assertions and refutations are not to be found in the mind only. The ignorant who understand not that the mind is seen in the form of the body, property, and abode, wander about with assertions and refutations." At that moment the Blessed One said this to elucidate the meaning of this verse: "Mahamati, there are 4 forms of assertion made concerning things not in existence. What are the 4? 1. The assertion about individual marks that are non-existent. 2. The assertion about philosophical views which are non-existent, i.e., not true. 3. The assertion about a cause which is non-existent. And 4. The assertion about objects that are non-existent. These, Mahamati, are the 4 assertions." Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the refutation? It means not examining properly, because of ignorance, any assertions based on errors. This, Mahamati, is what characterizes assertion and refutation. Further, Mahamati, what are the characteristics of the assertion made about individual marks that have no existence? It concerns the marks of individuality and generality in the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas, which do not really exist, but taking them for realities and getting attached to them, a man may affirm that they are just so, and not otherwise. This, Mahamati, characterizes the assertion of the individual marks which are non-existent. This assertion and discrimination, Mahamati, concerning individual marks that are non-existent, rises from one's attachment to the habit energy which is amassed, since beginningless time, by varieties of erroneous views issuing from false imagination. This, Mahamati, characterizes the assertion of individual marks which are non-existent. Again, Mahamati, by the assertion of philosophical views which are non-existent, or not true, is meant that in the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas, some philosophers assume the existence of an ego, a being, a soul, a living being, a nourisher, or a spirit. This is said, Mahamati, to be the assertion of some philosophical views which are non-existent, or not true. Again, Mahamati, by the assertion of a cause that is non-existent is meant that some philosophers assume some causeless birth of a first vijnana, which later comes to have a Maya-like non-existence. That is to say, the originally unborn Vijnana begins to function under the conditions of I, form, light, and memory. The functioning goes on for a while and then ceases. This, Mahamati, is the assertion of a cause that is non-existent. Again, Mahamati, the assertion about objects that are non-existent is an assertion arising from the attachment to such non-working existences as space, cessation, and nirvana. These, Mahamati, are neither existent nor non-existent, for all things are devoid of the alternatives of being and non-being, and are to be known, Mahamati, as the horns of a hare, a horse, or a camel, or like a hairnet. They are discriminated as realities by the ignorant who are addicted to assertions and refutations, as their intelligence has not penetrated into the truth that there is nothing but what is seen of the mind itself. It is otherwise with the wise. This, Mahamati, is the characteristic point of the assertion about objects which are non-existent. For this reason, Mahamati, one should avoid the views based on assertion and refutation. Further, Mahamati, the bodhisattvas who are thoroughly acquainted with the nature of the citta, manas, and manovijnana, of the 5 dharmas, of the 3 svabhavas, and of the twofold egolessness, will assume various personalities for the sake of benefiting others, just like the imagination that evolves from the seat of the relativity knowledge, and, again, like the mysterious gem that reflects varieties of colors. Going over to all the Buddha lands and assemblages, the bodhisattvas will listen to the Buddhas discourse on the nature of all things, which are like a vision, a dream, an illusion, a reflection, and the lunar vision and water, and which have nothing to do with birth and death, eternality, and extinction. The bodhisattvas thus facing the Tathagatas will listen to their discourses on the truth that does not belong to the Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha vehicles. They will then attain 100,000 samadhis, indeed 100,000 nayutas of kotis of samadhis, and by means of these samadhis they will go around from one country to another. They will do homage to the Buddhas, be born in all the celestial mansions, where they will discourse on the triple treasure, manifesting Buddha bodies, and, surrounded by Shravakas and Bodhisattvas, they will, in order to free them from the alternatives of being and non-being, instruct them to understand thoroughly what is meant by an objective world which is nothing but mind itself, and in which there are no realities. At that time, the Blessed One recited this verse: When those who are born of the Buddha see that the world is no more than mind itself, they will obtain a body of transformation, which has nothing to do with effect-producing works, but which is endowed with the powers, psychic faculties, and self-control. At that time, again, Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva made a request of the Blessed One. Tell me, Blessed One, how all things are empty, unborn, non-dual, and have no self-nature, so that I and other Bodhisattva Mahasattvas might be awakened in the teaching of emptiness, no birth, non-duality, and the absence of self-nature, and, quitting the discrimination of being and non-being, quickly realize the highest enlightenment. Then the Blessed One said this to Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva: Now, Mahamati, listen well and reflect well upon what I tell you. Replied Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva: I will indeed, Blessed One. The Blessed One said, Emptiness, emptiness indeed. Mahamati, it is a term whose self-nature is false imagination. Because of one's attachment to false imagination, Mahamati, we have to talk of emptiness, no birth, non-duality, and absence of self-nature. In short, then, Mahamati, there are 7 kinds of emptiness. 1. Emptiness of individual marks. 2. The emptiness of self-nature. 3. The emptiness of no work. 4. The emptiness of work. 5. The emptiness of all things in the sense that they are unpredictable. 6. The emptiness in its highest sense of ultimate reality, realizable only by noble wisdom. And 7. The emptiness of mutuality, which is the 7th. Mahamati, what then is the emptiness of individual marks? It is that all things have no such distinguishing marks of individuality and generality. In consideration of mutuality and accumulation, things are thought to be realities, but when they are further investigated and analyzed, Mahamati, they are non-existent, and not predictable with individuality and generality. And because thus no such ideas as self, other, or both hold good, Mahamati, the individual marks no longer obtain. So it is said that all things are empty as to their self-marks. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness of self-nature? Mahamati, it is that all things in their self-nature are unborn, hence the emptiness of self-nature, and it is therefore said that things are empty in their self-nature. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness of no work? It is that the skandhas are nirvana itself, and there is no work doing in them from the beginning. Therefore, one speaks to the emptiness of no work. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness of work? It is that the skandhas are devoid of an ego and its belongings, and go on functioning when there is a mutual conjunction of cause and action. Thus one speaks of the emptiness of work. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness of all things in the sense that they are unpredictable? It is that the nature of the false imagination is not expressible, hence the emptiness of all things in the sense of their unpredictability. Thus one speaks of emptiness of unpredictability. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness in its highest sense of ultimate reality, realizable by noble wisdom? It is that in the attainment of our inner realization by means of noble wisdom, there is no trace of habit energy generated by all the erroneous conceptions of beginningless past. Thus one speaks of the highest emptiness of ultimate reality realizable by noble wisdom. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness of mutual non-existence? It is this. When a thing is missing here, one speaks of its being empty there. For instance, Mahamati, in the lecture hall of the Mrigarama, there are no elephants, no bulls, no sheep, but as to the bhikshus, I can say that the hall is not devoid of them. It is empty only as far as they, i.e. the animals, are concerned. Further, Mahamati, it is not that the lecture hall is devoid of its own characteristics, nor that the bhikshu is devoid of this bhikshuhood, nor that in some other places too, elephants, bulls, and sheep are not to be found. Mahamati, here one sees all things in their aspect of individuality and generality, but from the point of view of mutuality, some things do not exist somewhere. Thus, one speaks to the emptiness of mutual non-existence. These, Mahamati, are the 7 kinds of emptiness, of which mutuality ranks the lowest of all, and is to be put away by you. Again, Mahamati, not that things are not born, but that they are not born of themselves, except when seen in the state of samadhi. This is what is meant by all things are unborn. To have no self-nature is, according to the deeper sense, to be unborn, Mahamati. That all things are devoid of self-nature means that there is a constant and uninterrupted becoming, a momentary change from one state of existence to another. Seeing this, Mahamati, all things are destitute of self-nature. So one speaks of all things having no self-nature. Again, Mahamati, what is meant by non-duality? It means that light and shade, long and short, black and white, are relative terms, Mahamati, and not independent of each other. As nirvana and samsara are, all things are not two. There is no nirvana except where is samsara. There is no samsara except where is nirvana. For the condition of existence is not of mutually exclusive character. Therefore, it is said that all things are non-dual, as are nirvana and samsara. For this reason, Mahamati, you should discipline yourself in the realization of emptiness, no birth, non-duality, and no self-nature. Then at that time the Blessed One recited this couplet of verses. I always preach emptiness, which is beyond eternalism and nihilism. Samsara is like a dream and a vision, and karma vanishes not. Space, nirvana, and the 2 forms of cessation. Thus the ignorant discriminate the things which are not effect-producing, but the wise stand above being and non-being. At that time again, the Blessed One said this to Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva. This teaching of emptiness, no birth, non-duality, and no self-nature is found in all the sutras of all the Buddhas, and this doctrine is recognized in every one of them. However, Mahamati, the sutras are the teaching in conformity with the dispositions of all beings and deviate from the real sense, and not the truth-preserving statement. Mahamati, it is like unto the mirage which entices the deer with its treacherous springs. The springs are not there, but the deer are attached, imagining them to be real. So, with the teachings disclosed in all the sutras, they are for all beings for the gratification of their own discriminating minds. They are not the truth-preserving statements meant for noble wisdom to grasp. For this reason, Mahamati, be in conformity with the sense, and be not engrossed in the word teaching. At that time, Mahamati the Bodhisattva Mahasattva said to the Blessed One, Now the Blessed One makes mention of the Tathagata Garbha in the sutras, and verily it is described by you as by nature bright and pure, as primarily unspotted, endowed with the 32 marks of excellence, hidden in the body of every being like a gem of great value, which is enwrapped in a dirty garment, enveloped in the garment of the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas, and soiled with the dirt of greed, anger, folly, and false imagination. While it is described by the Blessed One to be eternal, permanent, auspicious, and unchangeable, is not this Tathagata Garbha taught by the Blessed One the same as the ego substance taught by the philosophers? The ego, as taught in the systems of the philosophers, is an eternal creator, unqualified, omnipresent, and imperishable. The Blessed One replied, "No, Mahamati, my Tathagata-garbha is not the same as the ego taught by the philosophers. For what the Tathagatas teach is the Tathagata-garbha in the sense, Mahamati, that it is emptiness, reality limit, nirvana, being unborn, unqualified, and devoid of will effort. The reason why the Tathagatas, who are arhats and fully enlightened ones, teach the doctrine pointing to the Tathagata-garbha is to make the ignorant cast aside their fear when they listen to the teaching of egolessness, and to have them realize the state of non-discrimination and imagelessness. I also wish, Mahamati, that the Bodhisattva Mahasattva of the present and future would not attach themselves to the idea of an ego, imagining it to be a soul. Mahamati, it is like a potter who manufactures various vessels out of a mass of clay of one sort by his own manual skill and labor, combined with a rod, water, and thread, Mahamati, that the Tathagatas preach the egolessness of things which removes all the traces of discrimination by various skillful means issuing from their transcendental wisdom, that is, sometimes by the doctrine of the Tathagata-garbha, sometimes by that of egolessness, and, like a potter, by means of various terms, expressions, and synonyms. For this reason, Mahamati, the philosopher's doctrine of an ego substance is not the same as the teaching of the Tathagata-garbha. Thus, Mahamati, the doctrine of the Tathagata-garbha is disclosed in order to awaken the philosophers from their clinging to the idea of the ego, so that those minds that have fallen into the views imagining the non-existent ego as real, and also into the notion that the triple emancipation is final, may be rapidly awakened to the state of supreme enlightenment. Accordingly, Mahamati, the Tathagatas who are arhats and fully enlightened ones disclose the doctrine of the Tathagata-garbha, which is thus not to be known as identical with the philosopher's notion of an ego substance. Therefore, Mahamati, in order to abandon the misconception cherished by the philosophers, you must strive after the teaching of egolessness and the Tathagata-garbha. At that moment, then, the Blessed One recited this verse. The personal soul, continuity, the skandhas, causation, atoms, the Supreme Spirit, the ruler, the creator, they are discriminations in the mind only. Thus concludes Part 2 of Chapter 2 of the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. All right, that was Part 2 of Chapter 2 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. Docs, what did you think?
This one was a drag. I had a difficult time, I had to power through this reading because there's a whole lot of words spent saying relatively little. This is the first time where I've thought the Buddha almost sounds like a politician, the way he is saying the same thing over and over again with different words, none of which really mean that much. He's spending most of this sermon saying, you're wrong, everything I said before was not correct. It was because the people I were talking to were not as advanced. We haven't been lingering on the interdenominational sniping as much recently because we've seen it a lot. But this section of this sutra does that real hard in a way that feels like an escalation from things that we've been talking about before. Talking about people who turn away from the bodhisattva path are echantikas. Wow, the writers of this chapter woke up and chose violence.
Yeah, definitely. It was hard to read for me the first time and this time again as well because of the reasons you mentioned. It's just kind of, I don't want to say word salad, but it's so much, like you say, to say so little, and it's stuff that I have seen explained better in other sutras, and if I'm going to rely on an explanation, on a definition for a core Buddhist thing, I'm just going to go to those other sutras.
That said, if we're going to try to give a complete overview of what the sutras are like, we do have to talk about some we don't like once in a while, so here we are.
Here we are.
So, the opening section talks about purification being a gradual process, and then also it's an instant process. So we're getting into non-duality. We are leaving reason at the door. We are going to be contradicting everything. Things are about to get real esoteric and mind-bendy.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and this is a perennial concern among Chan thinkers, Zen thinkers, that, I'm going to be honest, it's never personally bothered me that much. This is not a world-shaking question to me. Is enlightenment sudden or gradual? But I respect that these people feel very strongly about this question, and they need the Buddha to speak on it, not just in this text, not just in this chapter of this text, but tons of times over the course of his preaching career. Maybe the fact that I don't care about it means that I'm an Achantaka, but I don't care. I think that it is an individual sort of experience. Like, if it's gradual for you, it's gradual for you. If it's sudden for you, it's sudden for you. Some people are visual learners. Some people learn by listening. Some people learn by doing. Some people learn by reading. Some people become enlightened all at one time after meditating for decades and not making any progress. And other people have these stepwise progressions. That's kind of how I personally think about it if I believe enlightenment is real in the first place. But here the Buddha is sort of saying this question of gradual versus instantaneous, it's both and it's neither. And the question is, he doesn't say the question is unimportant, but he does say the question is sort of a bad question.
I understand how this could be a concern for a group of religious practitioners. If the enlightenment experience is the end goal, then you need to know what that is like in order to be able to correctly diagnose whether you've made that goal or not. So it's a matter of discerning what is actually enlightenment and what is somebody thinking they've been enlightened incorrectly. That would be a good thing to get nailed down by the guy talking about it. So I understand why one would find that an important question, but I also don't share those priorities, so...
Well, and I would be on your side there too, except that the Buddha says in other texts that if you're worried about this question about what is enlightenment, do I have it, do I not have it, the answer is you don't have it.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of self-defeating to talk about in the first place, according to other stuff he said, which is why, again, I kind of glaze over whenever he spends a lot of time talking about it in this text, because in other texts, he doesn't entertain the question very well, but here he decides to.
So we have a term that comes up a lot in this sutra that is another really semantically loaded term that we need to dissect in order to be able to actually understand what's going on here, and that is the eternal unthinkable. So it seems like what he's getting at here is the idea of a creator deity that is eternal and beyond human comprehension. He makes some points to dismiss this idea, and I do not follow those points at all.
Yeah, this is a good question point, because this is, like you say, it's very core to what's going on here. So I want to say up front that the eternal unthinkable is both a creator deity, but it's also more than that. So I don't know if we've talked about Taoism very much on the show so far yet, but there's this understanding that there's a pattern or a means by which reality unfolds in Taoism. And coming to understand and know that pattern by which reality unfolds is sort of thought of as the highest level of realization or oneness with that. In Taoism, that pattern, that means, is called the Tao. And the eternal unthinkable could also capture the Tao in its definition. So it's a sentient creator deity on the one hand, according to some people, but it could also include these non-sentient processes or outflows that cause reality to keep going and keep unfolding and determine the means and the nature by which it does so. So in philosophical terms, it's a prime mover. So it could be sentient or not sentient, but it's definitely, regardless of its sentience or not having it, it's the unknowable, unfaltering, unwavering source code for all of reality. And it shapes all reality. And this is different from, in religious studies terms, what we would call ultimate reality. So if we were going to look at the Brahmins, the Hindu practitioners, according to this system, they don't think that Brahman is the prime mover. They don't think that it's the thing that determines how reality unfolds and how our experiences come to be. A nihilist might think it's all randomness. A Christian might think that God does it. Hindus don't think that Brahman is like that. ultimate reality in Christianity is heaven. Ultimate reality in Hinduism is Brahman. Ultimate reality in Buddhism, you might say, is enlightenment or nirvana. But this prime mover is something entirely different. So don't mistake it for like nirvana being the cause or for, Brahman being the cause. It's not quite like that. It's something that's like fundamental to how the world comes out. And so the main way that the Buddha discounts this is, of course, arguing that the idea of a creator God, whether sentient or non-sentient, is contradicted by causation and causality. He kind of goes after it the same way that he goes after the philosophers in the previous section, trying to find an original cause and a terminal end to the universe. A permanent and abiding creator God, or a characteristic of a creator God that determines reality, could not exist. He's not saying it's all randomness. He doesn't say that, like the nihilists think that everything that occurs is completely left up to chance. He's just saying that there's no hand in all of it, if that makes sense. It's way messier than that.
It seems like you could kind of sum this up by saying the eternal unthinkable in this sutra is referring to a single answer to the universe, and the Buddha is saying that does not exist.
Yeah, exactly. He's correctly pointing out that humans have this pathological tendency or need to magnify their own consciousness to the level of the universal and say that that consciousness, which is larger than theirs and of course unknowable and eternal, is sort of behind everything. That there's one singular hand that has its fingers in everything that happens to us. And the Buddha is saying, no, that's just not how it works at all. First off, you're magnifying an idea of a self to the level of the universal, which is bad. And you're also sort of de-individualizing karma in a way that is not how karma ought to be de-individualized. You're sort of saying that everything that happens is according to one singular hand, but the karma of somebody else, on the one hand, yeah, non-duality, my karma is everybody's karma, etc. But on the other hand, if someone is a preta, that's due to their past actions. That's not the hand that's interfering in your life, interfering in their life at all. According to the Buddha, that is their past greed, their past delusion, their past anger, hatred, ignorance. So because of the doctrine of the Alaya Vijnana, what happens to us, our day-to-day experiences, the unfolding of reality as it presents itself to our individual selves, as much as there is an individual self in Buddhism, which is shaky to begin with, it is entirely due to how karma works. It's not due to this invisible hand.
So that doesn't come in very clearly in the actual sutra, but now that we've discussed it, okay, that makes sense. So the internal unthinkable is a single answer to everything, and that's not a real thing that exists. So some of the arguments that are put forth to counteract the idea of eternal unthinkable and prop up the Buddhist ideas being solid are not that solid in the first place. Like, these arguments, they don't hold up to inspection by a rational thinker, which this is not for rational thinkers, so that makes sense, but that still annoys me. So, for example, it talks about the reason Buddhism does not need an original cause is because the Dharma is the cause of the highest reality, so it causes itself. And that is immediately circular in basically the exact same way that bothers me about Christian ideas. Like, I really dislike that. He talks about an eternal unthinkable being impossible because everything in creation observably has the property of impermanence. But there's nothing about a creator being eternal that requires the things that creator makes be eternal as well. I see no reason an eternal being could not create a impermanent thing. So these arguments are weak and strawmanny and like completely fall apart the moment you get outside of the bodhisattva mindset.
No, it's true. I totally get it. It's a religious answer to a question, and you're not a religious person. And so it's going to bounce off of you. It makes sense. I think that the system works in itself, but if you don't agree with the system kind of fundamentally, then it's kind of not work for you. Like, I think that whenever he says that there can't be a creator that makes impermanent things because of impermanence, for the one thing, I agree, like, yes, according to impermanence, as he has presented it, that doesn't make sense because the creator would be permanent and that can't be. But I also think that according to impermanence as he's presented it, if there was something that was permanent, then impermanence could not be at all ever. Like, I think that he's kind of pointing out that if impermanence really is truly true, then everything, everything, without limit in all of reality has to be subject to it. Because if even one thing is permanent, then the whole thing falls apart. If there is substantial permanent existence anywhere in the whole universe and all of reality, then impermanence as a concept falls apart at every minute level, because that's sort of like an anchoring point in reality where things can hinge around. And so, yeah, I get it. It's a religious answer, and that's not gonna jive, but I at least think that it works within itself as a system of thinking.
Well, most religions work in and of themselves as a system of thinking. If you're already inside of it, it makes sense. The way impermanence works, impermanence itself has to be a thing that is permanent, because as soon as one permanent thing exists, impermanence can never be true again, because there's a permanent thing there. So one instance of contradicting impermanence ruins all of it. And I agree with that. That's how the definitions of the words work. But also, declaring that something that is created as an impermanent thing, implying the impermanence of its creator, that does not track semantically. And this sutra is not trying to track semantically. So, I'm already wrong in this spot. But for me, I'm also approaching it from a writer's standpoint. This is not a very eloquent argument being made. It feels like the Buddha is acting without skill here. So it's like, from a writer's perspective, I'm like, you're not writing the character well because he's performing poorly. Like, there's a lot going on there that makes that particular sticking point hit me a lot harder than it otherwise would, I think.
Yeah, I totally get it. And we don't have to linger on it beyond this point, which is like, we kind of bounce off of it, but this is a point where a lot of Zen thinkers and a lot of Chan thinkers have thought that he is just shredding right now. You know, he's just like, he's got it all going on and he's putting it in a beautiful, perfect, amazing way in this passage. And we disagree with that for the reasons we stated, but there are people out there who do think this is something that works. And so I think that we might just be outside of the system. And because of that, we look at it and we have X, Y, and Z problems with it.
Yeah. And litigating those problems further is not useful because it's not something we're ever going to be convinced on or convince others on. So,
right.
So another point I want to talk about, we recently did an episode about Buddhism not being a world-negating religion, about not being a nihilistic religion. But we have a paragraph. The quote starts, this is the Buddha speaking, quote, "Further, Mahamati, according to the teachings of the Tathagatas of the past, present, and future, all things are unborn. Why? Because they have no reality, being manifestations of mind itself, and Mahamati, as they are not born of being and non-being, they are unborn." Unquote. That paragraph goes on to say some similar things and a similar idea, and this seems world-negating maximum to me. Here's a spot where I think the people talking about Buddhism being world-negating totally have a point. This is one of the most depressing and nihilistic things I've seen in these sutras. I know that's not how the folks in the system see it, but this paragraph negates the world.
Yeah, it's absolutely very, I would say, solipsistic in a way that we haven't seen in other texts to this point. And I think that there are people out there who have made the argument that this is solipsistic without knowing that they are sort of fueling the fire of saying that Buddhism is world negating. So there's this huge debate ongoing in Yogācāra scholarship and has been going on, I swear to you, for 100+ years in English language scholarship, but also in German and French scholarship. And this whole question is bouncing around about, okay, the Alaya Vijnana causes there to be perfumed, biased, influenced, imposed cognitions on the world around us. And so the things that we see as a tree, the things that we see as a car, the things that we see as a house, these seeings that we have of them being that way are likely not related at all to what they are in a very real sense, because there is no real sense in which they exist because of impermanence and because of mind only and so on. A lot of scholars in Europe and in America, especially further back in time, they were like, this is just solipsism. This is just pure, unabated. They might as well have copied it out of European philosophy, solipsism. And solipsism is very world negating because it's like nothing else exists. And so if it doesn't exist like I do, then it matters to a lesser level than I matter because I'm the thing that's real and nothing else is real. It's important to clarify that solipsism does not have any room for the self not existing also. It can kind of overlap with brain in a jar theory. It can kind of overlap with think therefore I am theories. It kind of has a lot of interpretive definitions in other philosophies, right? But I think that at the core of it, there is this I exist, nothing else does. And that automatically, subconsciously creates a hierarchy where self is at the top and everything else is below. And the more recent scholarship, the other side of this argument says, no, Alaya Vijnana is not solipsism because it also looks at the self and it says to the reader, what you view as a self, what you view as me, what you view as you, these things also don't exist. So this isn't a brain in a jar because there's no brain and there's no jar. I think that this is just missing that second part, this paragraph that you're talking about. It's completely missing, or maybe it gave it earlier in the text when it was first going through the Alaya Vijnana doctrine before. But here, it's completely missing the second part where it's like, yeah, everything is of mind, but also so are you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I would call it solipsistic. There's some solipsistic aspects to it for sure, but it's more a matter of like, when we talk about world negating, we're talking about the world not mattering. At least in this case, like that's what's going on. It feels like this is saying that the outside world we perceive isn't real. We're stupid for thinking it is. And the only thing worth doing is self-realization. Like that's world negating. That's every Buddhist tradition that came before this insulted. We can talk about translator agenda all we want, but like this paragraph is world negating. A mindset being also self-negating doesn't make it any less world negating. The idea of Buddhism as a nihilistic and depressing idea doesn't hold water usually, but right here it does. Like, those arguments have a point here.
Yeah, I think that it is missing the vital point, which is like all of these things are of mind. And so by purifying mind, then you purify them also. And by purifying them, you're carrying out the bodhisattva path, right? Like if it had that one sentence after the end of it, then it would completely do away with the world negating thing because it would couch this whole doctrine into a religious soteriology that has a positive endpoint, if that makes sense. And it has like a moral application.
That doesn't make it any less world negating. That's just arguing that negating the world is a good thing. That's not any less world negating in my mind.
I think the reason why I'm thinking of it as not being world negating, and this is all hypothetical, like I agree that this paragraph itself, by itself, is absolutely world negating. If it did have that extra sentence where it couched it into Buddhist morality, I don't think of it as more world negating because it doesn't say that the world doesn't matter if your job as a bodhisattva is to purify the world by purifying yourself. It's saying that, no, actually, purifying everything, including yourself, purifying the world and all the sentient beings in it, is the highest level of moral achievement, is the highest level of existence, of living, is the highest purpose. And so, in that sense, it sort of brings back some of the world mattering into the equation.
That's a point where we're going to have to agree to disagree. My come away from this paragraph, and the sutra as a whole, but this paragraph in particular, is the world is negated, and that's a good thing. And we're getting very different results from this, which is fine. We're different people, so that's how it goes.
Yeah, and I just want to mention, too, that like a lot of... So this is not the same message we always get, either. So the Buddha himself, in different sutras, will swing to one side or the other on this issue of world negation, right? So esoteric Buddhists see this kind of stuff, like I said, and they're saying because all things are mind and mind is Vairocana, all things are Vairocana, and that's a good thing. And Vimalakirti Sutra type doctrine will be like, yeah, all things are Alaya Vijnana, but you have to go and work where the suffering is and where the delusion is. So I guess what I'm saying is there are going to be twists and turns in the history of Buddhism after this text where some people look back on it and they say, yeah, that's a really somber, depressing, difficult doctrine. And there's going to be swings the other way where they say, this is, the highest level teaching. This is great. This is amazing realization. And it's not somber or dark or serious at all. So just like we're getting different results, there are different results from different thinkers over the course of Buddhist history in East Asia as well.
Let's move on a bit to talking the way this sutra talks about nirvana, and in the process, completely eviscerates the idea of being a Shravaka. Whoever wrote this sutra seems to really hate Shravakas. Absolutely, they do. And it's frankly rude at this point. Not even rude. This is calling them basically, in English terms, heretics. This is a Catholic Protestant level divide being described in this sutra. That's perhaps not how it plays out in real life, but in the text, calling Shravakas Echantikas. If I were to translate Echantika to an English word that people would understand, I would probably use heretic. So, Nirvana isn't real. Shravakas are dumb for clinging to Nirvana. And everything that I talked about as being the goal in previous sutras is a deception, not even a deception, a parable I use trying to speak to stupid people. Holy crap, this is insulting, and tears down almost everything that came before, leading me to a point of so what are we even working for at this point if nirvana is unimportant or already here? What are we doing at this point? Yeah, so this is an interesting part, and there's a lot of factors going into it, which would probably lead one to come to those conclusions. So one factor that I have to mention, and I won't linger on too much, is the translator does have a very pointed agenda here. So at the same time as Japanese Zen is being popularized in the West, so too is Southeast Asian / Indian Buddhism. And so naturally, there's Theravada on the one side and Mahāyāna on the other. And because the Mahāyāna texts originally themselves shoot down Theravada Buddhism, I think that the translator, DT Suzuki, wants to amplify that and hit that pretty hard, where the sutras, of course, are hitting it, but maybe not hitting it as hard as he is in the original. I'm not saying it's not sniping. It's absolutely sniping. But the original, I maintain, is not sniping any more or any less than any other Mahāyāna text that we've worked on before. The Lotus Sutra and the Vimalakirti Sutra and the Prajnaparamita Sutras, they all do it just about this amount. But it's coming through way more harshly because the translator wants Zen to work out, and Japan, by extension, to work out,
and not Theravada and by extension Southeast Asia and India to work out. So there's that. Another thing is, it's fascinating to me that this is something you're bouncing off of so hard, because we have sort of seen this before in other texts. He's saying there is a non-dual relationship between nirvana and samsara. And that's sort of the entire argument of the Vimalakirti Sutra. And I don't recall you bouncing off of it then. Like, I understand if you disagree with that assertion.
I bounced off it pretty hard there as well. The thing that hits me here is the word echantika. I don't think there's a worse status to be in Buddhism. Like, is there a less spiritually advanced spot to be in Buddhism than in Chantika? Because it seems like this is the highest insult that can be given.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that is another point about this passage that I wanted to bring up that's very important. So you mentioned that you would translate echantika as heretic, and many people have and many people do translate it that way. But it's important to note, actually, that the definition of echantika is much wider, and also, I would say, less evil than heretic, or I should say less mean-spirited than heretic. So
I would say localize instead of translate. I'm aware that that's not a good translation, but if you're talking to somebody who does not know Buddhist terminology, what I would say is you can think of an echantika as kind of like a heretic.
Yeah. So the definition in Buddhism is just by itself simply somebody who does not achieve nirvana, right? And that doesn't stop them from doing lots of good things. And it doesn't really pass judgment on what that means one way or the other as to their relationship to the Dharma.
I disagree. In order to not have that level of insult going on, there are so many spots where you have to cut off the criticism before it comes up. We're talking about someone who cannot achieve enlightenment. It's an echantika. Like, that's what echantika means, as I understood it. It's someone who cannot or will not. That's not the same thing as does not.
Well, that's the important hinging point right there. There are debates about this definition, and where I have landed on the debate is that echantika does not speak to ability, it speaks to result. So there's a difference between cannot and does not. And what I wanted to point your attention to for this is, in this text, he mentions that there are such a thing as bodhisattva echantikas.
He says that all bodhisattvas are enchantikas, but the reason they do that is because they don't want nirvana. Their oath removes them from nirvana. Like, their oath is to enlighten all sentient beings, and that's never going to happen because there's an effectively unlimited number of sentient beings, which means they're not going to achieve nirvana. Like, that's more of a semantic issue.
Well, that's the thing, is that, like, echantika applies to them just as much as it applies to any other. So let me preface, it is unfair to say that all Shravakas everywhere are echantikas, because I simply don't think that's true. But the word itself, echantika, is, all I'm saying, is not meant necessarily as a Buddhist insult. It includes people who slander the Dharma, people who hate the Dharma, people who reject the Dharma, but it also includes people who can become very highly spiritually advanced, like bodhisattvas. It just speaks to the fact that they do not achieve enlightenment, and it doesn't speak to their ability or their refusal specifically. It's just somebody who does not. I agree here that it's an insult to Shravakas and everybody. It's used as an insult here, and I think that's enough to move on with. So before we were talking about echantikas, you were mentioning that there was nirvana is not actually a goal, it's actually here, and it calls into question, like, what are we all working towards? Like, what's the point? What is the reason why you've told us to meditate and study if there's the emptiness of no work, or, the emptiness of the exertion towards nirvana?
Yeah. So towards the end of this reading, we get to the 7 different types of emptiness. And the way these are set up, like, this also is very world negating in that it makes effort seem futile. Like, the emptiness of no work. The skandhas are nirvana itself, and there is no work doing in them from the beginning. Like, I'm not sure how to parse that, because it makes it sound like we are already in nirvana, and so, like, what are we doing?
I think that he's trying to draw a non-dual relationship between this idea that we might have of here as samsara and there as nirvana. I think that it's a reimagination of kind of what the meaning and definition of the path of practice is. He's sort of going from thinking of like a path with an ending to sort of an unending, constant path, which is its own thing. The thing that it is going towards is the thing that it is, so to speak. And it's just, I think it's a non-dual relationship between the world we live in now and the potential that it has to be nirvana based on how we exert ourselves or don't exert ourselves. It's very esoteric. Like, it's very Shingon Buddhism. You can say that the 5 skandhas are all nirvana because the 5 skandhas are all Vairocana, and Vairocana is nirvana. He has nirvana. He's there. He's fully enlightened. He's achieved, the highest level of Buddhahood. And because the skandhas are a manifestation of him, how could they be something separate or different from what he is, which is the totality of nirvana, the universality of Buddhahood? So it's, again, we swing back and forth in different texts about this relationship between practice and nirvana. But I think here we're swinging to one extreme where he's saying that nirvana is everything and it's all here. And if we're exerting ourselves because we think it's capital T there on the far shore, to use an image he's used before, then we're spinning our wheels a little bit.
And speaking of spinning our wheels, so found a specific paragraph I want to point at, talking about the different types of emptiness, and in particular, I am going to focus on the emptiness of work. This is the Buddha speaking, quote, "Again, Mahamati, what is meant by the emptiness of work? It is that the skandhas are devoid of an ego and its belongings, and go on functioning when there is a mutual conjunction of cause and action. Thus one speaks of the emptiness of work." That sounds like a super nihilistic idea to me. The way I'm hearing that, it's talking about how the skandhas have no ego. We are the skandhas. Therefore, we have no ego, and therefore we have no free will? Like that, or am I missing something? Like, it seems like it's saying that because of the way the skandhas are, because of the way the universe works, working is empty. So what? I don't understand.
Yeah, so I mentioned in our last episode that he's very interested, DT Suzuki, in Western psychology. And so there are a lot of places where when the Buddha is talking about an Atman, that he translates that as an ego. And so he's just saying that the skandhas don't have an Atman, and we are aggregations of skandhas, and we don't have an Atman either. And they'll continue to aggregate regardless of us, so to speak. Like, we're not doing any work consciously on a day-to-day basis holding our skandhas together. If we let go of the skandhas, if we reach the highest level of enlightenment and no longer aggregate in this way, that doesn't mean that no aggregation will ever occur again, ever, for anybody, anywhere. The skandhas are sort of, I guess what it's like saying is basically, okay, you're a planet in the universe, and your being round has nothing to do with what kind of planet you are. And if the planet blows up big enough, then there will be no planet anymore. But there still will be, dust condensing into big stony spheres in the universe in general because of gravity, right? So aggregation continues regardless of if you, this planet, are here or not.
I guess at that point, I don't understand why, first of all, calling that the emptiness of work is not a good name for that, because that's more... I'm trying to figure out the way to express what's going on here in my head. Like, I don't understand why this is here if there's no action to be taken on it. Like, this entire section talking about the different types of emptiness, the explanations are thin and short and insufficient for my understanding, at least. So I'm just trying to understand why this is here, because it doesn't follow very well, and I don't see how it's doing anything useful in this sermon. And I kind of feel that same way about most of this particular section. Like, why are we here? What good is this doing? This is deconstructing a lot without putting much up in its place in a way that just confuses me at this point.
I think that from an authorial perspective, it is anticipating opinions that we don't have and that we don't know anybody who would have, but who might have existed, back in the past whenever this was being written. I think it's speaking to schools of thought or groups of people with opinions that are unfamiliar to us and don't make a lot of sense to us.
Okay.
I don't because of the way that we've presented this show, I don't think there's anybody who would say that the skandhas aggregating is the result of work. And I mean like the physics term, like work.
Right.
There's nobody who would say that. And we don't think that, of course, either. But I guess the authors are thinking, okay, maybe there's people who are buying into this idea of the skandhas, but they don't understand that they are unrelated to the physics idea of work. And of course, they weren't speaking of the physics idea of work, but something similar. And so they were like, we have to put this in here to sort of account for that.
So this is addressing a context that does not exist in the modern day, which is why it's not translating to the modern day.
Exactly.
I can accept that explanation. That's perfectly plausible.
And there's, like you say, there's a lot of stuff like that in this text.
All right. I think that covers the points I wanted to get to. What about you?
I am all set.
All right, cool. Well, I think that is an episode then. So let's wrap it up.
That was part 2 of chapter 2 of DT Suzuki's translation of the Laṅkāvatāra Sutra. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks for listening.
Hi, Nick here. Just wanted to jump in at the top of the show to say big thank you to our 2 patrons, Tanner and Wooly. If you would like to join them, you can find us on patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com, or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.